My name is David Brown. I have decided to do another movie video, and it's going to be a bit different. I'm going to be talking about the movie The Thing, that is from 1982, as opposed to the 2011 prequel or remake and the 1951 film The Thing from Another World. I very recently reviewed this movie on my own site, my blog, and I had really never intended to. I only did that because I had just seen the 40th anniversary release, and what really here to talk about, which I partly covered in the review, is just how this movie fared historically. I feel like it's gotten popular enough that there's kind of some myths around it, and especially there's a perception that it was underrated or even unsuccessful at the time. And what I'll be talking about is really a pretty specific time frame between when this movie came out, again in 1982, and maybe 2005. And I feel like it's since then that the movie has gotten the reputation it has now. So, the first thing to deal with, as far as how it's perceived, is that it's now getting often described as a box office failure, even a bomb. If you really look at the balance, it cost $15 million to make, and this was at a time when the big budget films like Empire Strikes Back or the 1980 Flash Gordon were being made for 20 to 30 million. So it was a medium budget film, and its actual performance was that it earned 20 million. So factor in the take for the theaters, the expenses like marketing. It would have lost money, but proportionately not a lot of money, or even absolutely. If you look at other films, especially science fiction and fantasy, you can find ones that did much worse, like films that cost 20 to 30 million and didn't even earn what The Thing cost to make. And there's also gotten to be a perception that it was being ignored, or at least being treated unfairly, and that's the part that's complicated. If you really look, or were looking, there was a lot of ways where it was controversial, but you really can't say it was ignored. I've seen The Thing mentioned in books that were published pretty soon after its release, like by 1984. It was still getting mentioned very regularly through books from the 1990s into the 2000 to 2005 period. So some of the controversy was things about the film that were more incidental, especially the level of violence and gore. There was also criticism from people who really hadn't liked Carpenter's work as a rule. But the biggest thing was that it was perceived as a remake of the 1951 film, so unavoidably the fans of that film were getting very critical of this film. And that's something where I anymore would try not to be involved. I've been very critical of the 1951 film, but I'll admit that was for reasons not related to its quality. Now, the real issue as far as what this film is, it was marketed as a remake, and up to a point it was conceived as a remake. This is what you'll see if you go back uh, to even before John Carpenter was involved with the project. But what it really came out as was an original adaptation of the source for the original movie, which was an even older science fiction novella called Who Goes There by John Campbell. He's now best known as the editor of astounding science fiction, what became Analog. And I would say it was that decision that made this movie as good as it is. And another thing I've admitted from my background, I was actually a fan of the story before I saw any of the movies. So in those terms, this I would consider definitive just because they did adapt the story instead of doing something different. And I would also have to say that's the main reason why I haven't, maybe never will, really give the 1950s movie very serious attention. I could accept it on its own, but as an adaptation of the story, the way I've put it, they had no shape shifting at all. And in hindsight, that would be like making a version of The Lost World, that is, Arthur Conan Doyle's novel The Lost World, without any dinosaurs. But that's all hindsight, what we have the benefit of now. And again, it was just not the same in the 80s, the 90s, or even the 2000s. And this is really about as much as I've meant to cover. The main thing I'd have to say to add to that is just the context. And this is where I'm going to sound like an old timer saying how good the new people have it nowadays, but it's really true. It's easier to find good 80s movies, especially 1980s science fiction, fantasy, horror movies now than it was in the 1980s. You had to go to the video stores either to buy or to rent, and even buying was more of a thing in the 1990s than the 80s. And it was a complete crapshoot what you were going to get. I had to deal with a video store that wouldn't stock the 1933 original version of King Kong. That's how random the selections could be. But this was a movie that would usually be there if you were looking for it. And I think that's what kept people aware of this movie. And if it was widely available without having to look at multiple stores, then it was really a fairly successful film. It had to be just to be easy to find. And something else I will say, I didn't see this movie until maybe right before 2000, and my first impression wasn't favorable. It was when I came back to the film that I started appreciating it more, and I think that's also part of what changed. There were more people coming to it, or coming back to it, and especially more people who didn't have the experience of watching the 1951 film to define their frame of reference. So this is a great film, probably the most influential film I've ever reviewed, outside of a couple I wouldn't have others I wouldn't have reviewed under normal circumstance. It's probably Carpenter's most influential film, though I might actually put it behind They Live, as far as just how much fun his movies can be. Uh, so I'm going to go ahead and sign out. And if you watch this videos, may notice I'm not really good at that. So I'm just calling it a day for now. Watch this movie or watch any other good movie. Because they're out there, and as I've said, you can get to good 80s movies a lot more easily now than we could back then.